My first year out of college, I moved into a cheap two-bedroom apartment with my old friend, Liam. He was the perfect roommate, clean, quiet, and respectful. The only quirk he had was that he was a lifelong sleepwalker. He warned me about it the day we moved in, laughing it off as a harmless habit. For the first few months, it was exactly that. I'd occasionally find him standing in the living room in the middle of the night, staring at a blank TV screen. Or I'd hear him mumbling nonsensically in the hallway. I'd just gently guide him back to his room, and he'd have no memory of it in the morning. It was more of an oddity than anything else, a funny story to tell our friends. But then, his nocturnal wanderings started to change. It began subtly. I came out for a glass of water one night and found him in the kitchen, not just standing there, but methodically opening and closing every single cabinet door, one by one, in complete silence. There was a purpose to his movements that hadn't been there before, a deliberate, almost ritualistic quality that made my skin crawl. The air in the room felt heavy and cold, and the look on his sleeping face wasn't vacant, but focused, as if he were concentrating on a very important task.
The boundary between our spaces began to dissolve. I started waking up to find the door to my own bedroom, which I always kept closed, slightly ajar. Then, one morning, I found a book from my nightstand placed perfectly in the center of the kitchen table. I knew it had to be Liam, but when I asked him about it, his face was a mask of genuine confusion and fear. He apologized profusely and promised to see a doctor, but the incidents grew more specific and more personal. He started going into my room while I slept. I'd wake up in the dead of night with that primal sixth sense that I wasn't alone, and I'd see his silhouette standing in the doorway, perfectly still, just watching me. The first time it happened, I nearly screamed, but I managed to choke it down, remembering all the warnings about not startling a sleepwalker. I would lie there, feigning sleep, my heart hammering against my ribs for what felt like hours, until he would finally turn and leave. He started moving things in my room, not randomly, but with a chilling intent. He'd turn a framed photo of my family to face the wall. He'd take one shoe from a pair and hide it. It felt like a slow, psychological campaign being waged by a person who wasn't my friend.
The talking started a few weeks after that. It was no longer the incoherent mumbling of before. One night, I found him standing in front of the hallway mirror, his back to me. His posture was rigid, and his head was cocked as if listening to someone. Then he spoke, and the voice that came out of his mouth sent a shard of ice through my veins. It was his voice, but it was deeper, flatter, and completely devoid of any emotion. He wasn't talking to his reflection, he was having a conversation. "He's weaker than the last one," the voice said, low and clear. "He feels us watching, he's afraid." A long pause followed, filled only by the hum of the refrigerator. Then a soft, mirthless chuckle. "Soon," the voice said. "He just needs to be a little more broken." I backed away into my room, my mind reeling. Who was us? Who was he talking about? It was clear he was talking about me. The person in my apartment was no longer Liam. It was something wearing his face, a cold, calculating presence that had taken up residence in my friend's sleeping mind.
My fear finally outweighed my caution. The next time I found him standing in my doorway, I broke the cardinal rule. "Liam," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Liam, wake up!" For a moment, nothing happened. Then his head snapped towards me with an unnatural speed. In the dim light from the hallway, I saw his eyes. They were wide open, but they weren't the warm, friendly eyes of my friend. They were dark, ancient, and filled with a cold, piercing intelligence that was utterly alien. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. It was not Liam's smile. He took a deliberate step into my room, and in that same flat, dead voice, he said, "You shouldn't have done that." Before I could react, his body went limp, and he collapsed onto the floor in a heap. A second later, he groaned, sitting up with the bewildered, groggy expression of someone who had just been woken up. "What? Mark, what am I doing in here?" he asked, his voice completely normal. The shift was so sudden, so total, that it was more terrifying than the threat itself.
I moved out a week later. I couldn't explain it to him without sounding insane, so I just made up an excuse about a family emergency. I left him in that apartment, and I never spoke to him again. I couldn't. Every time I looked at him, I didn't see my friend. I saw the cold, intelligent thing that looked out of his eyes in my bedroom that night. I am still haunted by the unanswered questions. What was it that lived inside him when he slept? Was it a part of his own subconscious? Or was it something else entirely? A tenant I never saw, who only came out in the dark. The true horror is not knowing. It's the realization that the person you trust most can become a vessel for a complete and terrifying stranger the moment they close their eyes, leaving you alone in the house with a body that is no longer being driven by the person you thought you knew.
When my daughter, Sophie, was 7, she started sleepwalking. Our pediatrician assured us it was common, a phase that many children go through and would lightly outgrow. At first, it was manageable. We'd find her in the kitchen, trying to pour a glass of milk, or in the living room, staring out the window at the dark, empty street. My wife, Clara, and I would take turns gently leading her back to bed. We put extra locks on the doors and a chime alarm on her bedroom door to alert us if she wandered. We thought we had it under control. We were so naive. The sleepwalking wasn't the problem. The problem was who she was walking to meet. It began one summer night when the chime on her door woke me up. I found the front door unlocked and wide open. Panic seized me as I ran outside, my bare feet cold on the dew-soaked grass. I found her in the middle of our backyard, her back to me, looking up at the tall oak tree that bordered the woods behind our house.
She was talking. It was a hushed, one-sided conversation, with long pauses as if she were listening to someone respond. "Okay," she'd whisper. "I promise I won't tell." My blood ran cold. I called her name softly, and she turned, her eyes open but glassy and unfocused in the moonlight. I led her back inside, my heart pounding. When I asked her about it the next morning, she remembered nothing. Just a fuzzy dream about talking to a big bird. But it kept happening. Night after night, she would disable the chime, unlock the door, and go to the same spot in the yard. Her conversations became more detailed. We'd listen from the porch, hidden in the shadows, too afraid to intervene. She was talking to someone she called the Root Man. She would describe him to us the next day as part of her dreams, a very tall, skinny man made of tree branches who would whisper stories to her about the stars.
The stories he told her were not children's stories. One morning at breakfast, Sophie casually mentioned that the Root Man told her about our neighbor's cat. He said Mr. Henderson's kitty went to sleep under the ground because his insides got all sleepy from bad berries, she said with childlike innocence. 2 days later, a distraught Mr. Henderson told us they had found their cat, who had died from eating poison berries from a bush in the woods. Sophie couldn't have known that. There was no way. The dreams were becoming too specific, too real. We were living in a state of constant low-grade terror. Who was this person talking to our daughter in the middle of the night? Was it a real person, a dangerous stranger hiding in the woods? Or was it something else? We swept the woods, called the police for a patrol, but found nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing to suggest a person had been there.
Driven by a desperate need for answers, I installed a high-end night vision camera aimed at the backyard, focused on her spot under the old oak tree. The first night, we watched the live feed on a monitor in our bedroom, our nerves frayed. Around 2 a.m., Sophie's door opened, and we watched her little white nightgown-clad figure walk out into the yard. She stood in her usual spot and began to talk. On the screen, she was completely alone. The audio picked up her soft whispers, but the only response was the chirping of crickets. And then we saw it. As she gestured, talking animatedly to the empty space in front of her, the long grass at her feet moved, flattening in a clear, circular path around her, as if a heavy, unseen presence were pacing back and forth, listening to her. We watched, mouths agape, as a single heavy branch on the oak tree dipped down low, almost touching her head on a completely windless night.
The next night, we saw her walk out to the tree again. This time, she didn't speak. She just stood there, her head tilted, listening for nearly 10 minutes. Then she turned and walked directly back towards the house. As she came back inside, we met her in the hallway. Her eyes were wide and focused, but it wasn't her. It was a cold, ancient look. She stopped in front of me, reached out a small hand, and placed something in my palm. It was a single, perfectly preserved raven's feather, cool to the touch. "He said this is a warning," she said, her voice a flat, emotionless monotone. "He doesn't like being watched." Then her eyes fluttered, and she blinked, looking up at me in confusion. "Daddy, why are we in the hallway?" She had no memory of it, but the feather in my hand was real. It was solid proof that something was out there with her in the dark.
We saw a specialist the next week, a child psychologist who also dealt with parasomnias. He put her on a mild medication, something to deepen her sleep cycle. And just like that, it stopped.
The sleepwalking ceased completely. Sophie was back to being our happy, normal little girl. We never told her the full story, the things she said, the camera footage, or the feather. We tried to convince ourselves it was all just a series of vivid night terrors, a child's overactive imagination creating a narrative to explain her own nocturnal wanderings. We wanted to believe that more than anything.
But we moved out of that house 6 months later. I couldn't stand to look at that oak tree. Sometimes I wonder if we just treated the symptom and not the cause. We stopped her from walking out into the yard, but did we just lock her in the house with the memories? We don't know who or what the root man was. We don't know if he was a spirit, a figment of her imagination, or something far worse. All I know is that for one summer, my daughter had a visitor that only she could see. A visitor who knew our secrets and did not like to be watched. The feather is still locked away in a safe deposit box, a dark little secret between my wife and me, and a terrifying reminder of the man made of roots.
I've been a sleepwalker my whole life. For me, it was never terrifying, just deeply inconvenient. I'd wake up to find I'd made a 7-decker sandwich in the kitchen, or folded all my laundry and put it in the refrigerator. My family, and later my partners, learned to deal with it. I was Sleepy Me, a harmless, clumsy ghost who haunted my own home. I took precautions, locked the doors, and hid my car keys. I thought I knew my other self, this subconscious wanderer. But I was wrong. I didn't know him at all. The change was gradual, a slow poisoning of my own sense of safety. It began after I moved into an old apartment building downtown, a place with thin walls and long, echoing hallways. I started waking up exhausted, more tired than when I went to bed, with a strange coppery taste in my mouth and deep, aching pains in my jaw, as if I'd been grinding my teeth all night with incredible force.
Then came the physical evidence that Sleepy Me was evolving. I woke one morning to find a thin, deep scratch running the length of the hallway wall, starting at my door and ending at the elevator. It was at my exact shoulder height. My fingernails were clean. Another morning, I found my front door deadbolted from the inside, but with a new deep gouge in the wood right next to the lock, as if someone had tried to pry it open with a screwdriver. I lived alone. The only possible culprit was me. The harmless sandwich-making ghost was gone, replaced by someone who was angry, destructive, and trying to get out. The thought that my own body was doing these things without my consent was a unique and profound kind of horror. I was becoming a prisoner in my own skin every time I fell asleep.
The psychological toll was immense. My waking hours were spent in a state of high anxiety, searching my small apartment for clues about what I had done the night before. I became an unwilling detective, and I was my only suspect. The breaking point came when my next-door neighbor, a quiet woman named Mrs. Gable, stopped me in the hall. She looked pale and nervous. I don't mean to pry," she stammered, "but is everything all right? I hear you at night sometimes, pacing and talking to yourself." I apologized, explaining my sleepwalking condition. She nodded, but her fear didn't subside. "It's not that," she said, lowering her voice.
It's what you say. Last night, you stood outside my door. I heard you. You just kept whispering the same thing over and over again." She took a shuddering breath. "I know you're awake," she said. "Let me in."
Her words hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just random sleep talking. It was targeted. It was menacing. My subconscious self was terrorizing my neighbors. Desperate, I did what everyone in my situation does in the 21st century. I set up a camera in my living room, pointing at my front door, determined to see for myself what I was becoming in the dark. I went to bed that night with a knot of pure dread in my stomach, knowing that in the morning I would have to face myself. When I woke up the next day, I didn't even make coffee. I went straight to my laptop, my hands shaking as I pulled up the video file from the night before. The first few hours were just static footage of my dark, silent apartment.
Then, at 3:17 a.m., I saw it. My bedroom door opened, and I walked out. But it wasn't me. The way I moved was all wrong. It was stiff, jerky, like a puppet on strings. My head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and my face, illuminated by the faint glow of the streetlights through the window, was completely blank. But the eyes were the worst part. They were wide open and glinting, and they were scanning the room with a sharp, predatory awareness. This was not a person who was asleep. This was a person who was awake, alert, and in control of a body that was not their own. He was a passenger, and he was wide awake.
I watched on the screen as this stranger wearing my body walked to the front door and began to pull at the handle, yanking it with a disturbing rhythmic violence. He didn't seem to have the fine motor skills to undo the deadbolt, which only made him angrier. He slammed his shoulder against the door, a low guttural growl rumbling in his chest. Then he stopped, went completely still, and turned his head slowly until he was staring directly into the camera lens. A slow, knowing smile spread across my face. It was a smile of pure malice and contempt. He knew I was watching. He raised a hand and pointed a single finger at the camera, at me. He held the pose for a long, chilling minute before turning, walking back to my bedroom and closing the door behind him.
I deleted the footage. I couldn't bear to have it exist. I checked myself into a sleep clinic the next day. They loaded me up with sedatives and ran a battery of tests, but they could never replicate what I saw on that tape. The drugs keep the sleepwalking at bay, but I live in constant fear. Every night when I go to sleep, I know that I am not just resting. I am relinquishing control of my body to someone else. I don't know who he is or what he wants, but I saw him. He's the man who stays awake when I'm asleep. He's looking through my eyes, listening with my ears, and he is trapped inside me. And I know, with a certainty that chills me to my core, that all he wants is to get out.